Neill Kennedy is from Topeka, Kansas, and participates in community organizing against police brutality and grassroots initiatives, providing educational outreach and supporting political engagement in her hometown. She received a Bachelor's of General Studies in American Studies with a minor in Latina Studies, and is now currently a PhD student in American Studies at the University of Kansas. She is also a graduate teaching assistant in American Studies. Her research interests include the intersections of race, space, and place, immigration, settler colonialism, and labor history. Her current research project focuses on Mexican immigration and community building in Northeast Kansas. This project utilizes housing and labor histories, cultural production, archival sources, and oral histories to uncover how the creation, destruction of Mexican American neighborhoods and communities resist and reproduce assimilation, anti-blackness, and anti-immigrant sentiments. So I'm so proud to introduce this young woman, Neill Kennedy.
Thank you to Christina, that's Nazism Society, but also especially to Jeff Kaufman and all the students here who are part of the production of Zoot Suit. That's really why we're here, and I'm just going to be talking about the importance of cultural production and representation can have, and how we talk about history lessons. So I'm just going to go ahead and dive in. And so Zoot Suit is both a play and a movie, and it dramatizes the historical events of the Sleepy Lagoon murder trial and the Zoot Suit riots that took place between 1942 and 1944 in Los Angeles. The story follows a Zoot Suit-clad 38th Street gang and their leader Henry Reyna as they are criminalized for being pachucos, which is a term that is used to define the Chicanos who take part in the Zoot Suit subculture. After being arrested, some of the gang members are prosecuted for the murder of another Mexican youth that occurred during a fight that broke out at a party near the swimming hole in Lover's Lane, the Sleepy Lagoon. So you can kind of see Zoot Suit culture both in the first picture and this one as well. And the Zoot Suit became a cultural marker and a uniform that was defined by the wide-brim hat, the broad soldier-lawn coats, high-waisted peg-leg pants, the long dangling chains, and the hairstyle into ducktails. So the Zoot Suit was not only a symbol of the subculture, but also was interpreted through a racist lens that deemed these drapes as also anti-American because of the excessive fabric violated wartime consumer regulations. So the character pictured here on the left is the allegorical character and alter ego of the lead, Henry. His name is El Pachuco, and he helps to narrate Henry's inner drama and stands in for the Chicano subculture at large. As the Zoot Suiters are tried and convicted of the murder on the basis of their Chicano identity rather than any actual evidence. So this event is based on a real life murder, and it occurred on April 2nd, 1942, when Jose Diaz was found unconscious at the Sleepy Lagoon and taken to the hospital where he later died. The autopsy found he had a fracture of the base of the skull and 2 stab wounds, but the cause of his death remained a mystery. With the circumstances surrounding the murder are murky at best, this did not prevent the LAPD from detaining over 300 young men and women, including Henry Lavas and other members of the real 38th Street gang, as well as some teenagers who were not Pachucas, but simply Chicano youth who happened to live near 38th Street. Of the hundreds detained, questioned, and assaulted by LAPD, 17 young Mexican-American men were placed on trial as a group for the murder. You can kind of see some of these men pictured here in the holding cell of LA County Jail. And so they were mandated by the judge to stand trial in the same clothes they were arrested in and were denied basic hygiene. On January 13th, 1943, 9 of the defendants were convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to time in San Quentin prison. The rest were charged with lesser offenses and incarcerated in Los Angeles County Jail. Attorney Kerry McWilliams, in summing up George Frick's court decision, said, quote, "From the beginning of the proceedings, they savored more of a ceremonial lynching than a trial in a court of justice." So while the Sleepy Lagoon Defense Committee formed and mounted an appeal, the criminalization of the Zoot Suit in Chicano culture is sensationalized through the press and accumulated in a racist fever pitch known as the Zoot Suit riots. John Chiato describes the beginning of the riots as taking place on June 4th, 1943, when, quote, around 200 sailors set out for East Los Angeles and began to beat up any Mexican males dressed in a Zoot Suit. Aided by a police department who seemed to approve of the violence, the initial attacks quickly turned into a riot that lasted for a period of 9 days. So you can kind of see some of these sailors and also Army and civilians. And what they're carrying here are like plywood, and you can't see it really in the picture, but they hammered nails into the sticks to be able to get at the drapes. You can see how the pants here are really loose, so they rip it and they strip the Zoot Suiters naked and beat them up and leave them bloodied on the streets. But of all the people arrested, the hundreds of people who were arrested, only a few of them were actually the military members. The rest of them were the victims of these of the violence. So the Zoot Suit riots and the Sleepy Lagoon murder trial are events that shape Chicano and Chicano identity, and they also inform our understanding of United States history overall. But they are both often pushed to the margins of high school history textbooks and popular memory. This marginalization of Mexican American history is also localized in our Topeka community, but the production and the accompanying community events around this production are working to center those voices and showcase how history can be taught in a more comprehensive way. One way to work in this comprehension is with works of fiction, and they can relay the emotion, nuances, and intersections of history that textbooks and nonfiction sometimes miss. So personally, I recently realized the importance of literature has had not only on my understanding, but my love of history when I was assigned Toni Morrison's Beloved in one of my classes last semester. But my advisor, she's right here. Thank you. And, but the first time, in rereading the classic novel, it dawned on me that reading Beloved for the first time in my AP Literature and Composition class during my senior year of Topeka High, that was assigned by Mrs. Sigler, that's over here, so. I think I have a lot of teachers in this room, so I just want to shout out to them. And rereading this allowed me to begin to comprehend the true human cost of slavery and the deep ramifications of that national institution, which continue to reverberate through today. Beloved also raised questions regarding the structuring and limitations of the textbooks our schools use. In literature classes, students are encouraged to critique the work and to question the author's positionality. But history is too often taught as a series of objective facts. But the writing of history isn't objective at all. If we were to all write a history of yesterday, we would all have vastly different accounts. You would have to prioritize out of necessity and just to have a readable account of the narration. So, but what does that say when that prioritization tends to follow the narratives of white men of privilege? One of the consequences of this tendency to prioritize or even flat out rewrite history is what W.E.B. Du Bois entitled The Propaganda of History, in the last chapter of his foundational text, Black Reconstruction. He writes, "We have too often a deliberate attempt so to change the facts of history that the story will make for pleasant reading for Americans." Du Bois was explicitly referring to how historians inaccurately blamed the failures of Reconstruction after the Civil War on the newly self-emancipated Black community as the way to stage the guilt of slavery and to uphold white supremacy at the beginning of the era of Jim Crow. Du Bois is kind of one of the first people to really interrogate history as a subjective form rather than an objective form. So as a way to manipulate and undereducate the populace. And so for our purposes here, it's important to think about how the propaganda of history frames Mexican American history in regards to the Chicano movement and the Zoot Suit riots and the Sleepy Lagoon murder trial. One way in which the propaganda of history works to marginalize accounts like the Chicano movement is to regulate them into specialized fields of history or even to specific months. Paul Gilroy comments on the problems created with the subordination of certain histories in his work, The Black Atlantic, where he states, quote, "The history of slavery is somehow assigned to blacks. It becomes our special property rather than a part of the ethical and intellectual heritage of the West as a whole. The same can be said about the notion that the legacies portrayed in Zoot Suit should be taught in Mexican American studies classes and not in the required curriculum of U.S. history. The segmentation of history is so naturalized that some of you might be questioning why, during a talk about the historical context of Zoot Suit, I've been citing 3 different texts that would be considered Black studies. But that's precisely my point. History is taught in such a way that it doesn't foster critical thinking among students. It allows for the misconception that certain events, ideologies, and movements happen in vacuums, that the in-depth and critical teachings of slavery and the Chicano movement are not important to the overall understandings of U.S. history. This is a U.S. history textbook used by Topeka High, has over 1,100 pages of content, and the Chicano movement is covered in 3 pages. And there's no mention of Zoot Suit riots, the play, or anything else regarding that. This problem is not simply a matter of representation either. The lack of critical ethnic studies in primary school history classes perpetuates the notions of American exceptionalism and white supremacy. With the ramifications of the propaganda of history in mind, I'm first going to be focusing on the era in which the play and subsequent film were written and produced in, before contextualizing the historical background that the story encompasses. Both the play and the film were written by Luis Valdez. Valdez was born in Delano, California in 1940 to Armeda and Francisco Valdez, who immigrated from Mexico and worked as migrant farm workers. Valdez was the second of 10 children and also worked in the fields with his parents from a young age. That experience left an indelible mark on Valdez as he returned to Delano in 1965 after graduating from San Jose State University to join the United Farm Workers Campaign. There he formed El Teatro Campesino, a farm workers theater group that toured the migrant camps to educate and uplift the striking workers. They also toured neighboring cities to raise money for the strikes. The plays the groups first wrote, directed, and performed were typically short one-act plays that are based on the experiences of migrant farm workers. But they soon began to encompass other aspects of Chicano culture. The convergence of current political movements and the larger narratives of Chicano history would continue to influence Valdez as he relocated to the south of San Francisco and combined the now fully professional production company with a culture center named El Centro Campesino Cultural in 1971. That would be the setting for where Valdez would write Zoot Suit. But the play opened in Los Angeles at the Mark Tabor Forum in April of 1978 and became the first professionally produced Chicano play. So while the play is set 20 to 30 years prior to the Chicano movement, it is very much making a current political statement, and it's illustrative of that time period as well as the Zoot Suit era. Ashley Lucas describes the importance of Luis Valdez and his theater company, saying that they, quote, used political performance to gain support from the United Farm Workers and the anti-war movement in the 1960s and 70s. Zoot Suit builds on the political work done by activists and artists during the Chicano movement by refashioning the once criminalized Zoot Suiter as a symbol for Chicano power. The play attacks the 1940s media's condemnation of young Mexican Americans and their culture, while also portraying the events that terrorized Mexican Americans literally and symbolically during the trials and the riots. While the Chicano movement is mostly memorialized via the UFW and the strikes organized by Dolores Huerta, Cesar Chavez, and the migrant farm workers, the cultural production of the movement, like Zoot Suit, should be remembered alongside it. The importance of popular memory is represented in the fact that the first 2 LA runs of the play sold out, and the extended run had to be held at the Aquarius Theater. But on the other hand, its Broadway debut only lasted 5 weeks and received less critical acclaim from the New York press than it did from the LA critics. I argue that the reception difference between Los Angeles and New York can be located in the differing levels of historical knowledge on both the Sleepy Lagoon murder trial and the Zoot Suit riots, as well as the Chicano movement. The Southern California community lived through these events. People who might have been the victims of the riots, might have been in attendance at the performances, the same newspapers that sensationalized the murder trial and the riots were publishing reviews of the play. In LA, the play is not simply being positioned as only a Chicano play, but rather popular memory allows the production to be seen as part of California and American history. This is not to say that the events depicted in Zoot Suit, the Chicano movement, or even Zoot Suit culture were not present in New York or anywhere else outside of Southern California, but rather popular memory placed them outside the normative narrative of history. The confinement of Chicano culture to the American Southwest is also present here in Topeka. I've already mentioned that Zoot Suit riots are nowhere to be found in the U.S. history textbooks that Topeka High assigns, and that Mexican Americans are only represented sparsely in other chapters. But even outside of traditional schooling, there's a downplaying of Mexican American culture in Topeka and the Midwest more broadly. So I grew up in Oakland, 2 blocks away from Our Lady of Guadalupe, next door to my grandparents who were born in Topeka in 1926 to Mexican immigrants. I thought I had a pretty good grasp of what it meant to be Mexican in Topeka over a long span of time. That's me over there, circa 1999. And then right here is a blurry picture of one of the first fiestas that took place in Oakland around 1934. And so this is where I grew up around. But the more I researched, the more I talked to my grandfather, the more I realized that my grasp on the reality is actually holding on by the fingertips. This is why this was again highlighted during last week's community panel that was held at Topeka High Library, where my grandfather, Sal Escobedo, along with several other Topekans, discussed their experiences as Mexican American growing up from the 30s to the 60s in neighborhoods such as the Bottoms, Neutral, and Oakland. The panelists shared stories of tragic loss and discrimination, but also reminisced on the strong sense of community and cultural identity that was fostered in these neighborhoods. As first and second generation American citizens, the Mexican youth of these three multiracial working class neighborhoods began to carve out Chicano identity in the middle of the heartland that wasn't so different from the youth culture being curated in Los Angeles. During the panel, my grandfather discussed donning zoot suits as a teenager in Topeka before he was drafted into the service during World War II. But it's important to note that neither here nor in LA were zoot suits worn only by Chicanos. The style was adopted across racial lines. In the movie, one of the members of the 38th Street Gang that is convicted alongside Henry is Tommy Roberts, a white teenager. My grandfather's own drapes, as they are also called, are also evident of this cross-racial culture, as they are hand-me-downs from his older cousins who were half Mexican and half black. While the zoot suit was sported by youth of differing racial identities, the style was inherently a working-class movement and set the foundation for many of the zoot suiters' future political activity. Robin D.G. Kelly discusses the importance of zoot suit culture in the life of one of the U.S.'s most prominent political figures, Malcolm X. So right here we have the real Malcolm X in a zoot suit, and then Denzel Washington and Spike Lee in the film version. In his autobiography, Malcolm X narrates his zoot suit wearing days as a youthful transgression and as distinctly pre-political. But Kelly argues that his, quote, participation in the underground subculture of black working class youth during the war was not a detour on the road to political consciousness, but rather an essential element of his radicalization. The zoot suiters and hipsters who saw alternatives to wage work and found pleasure in new music, clothes, and dance styles of the period were race rebels of sorts, challenging middle-class ethics and expectations and carving out a distinct generational and ethnic identity and refusing to be good proletarians. Kelly's argument highlights that even if zoot suiters didn't see themselves as making a political statement against the normative American culture, the status quo saw their style as an affront to so-called American middle-class values. In this passage, Kelly also hints at the generational conflict between parents and the zoot suiters who saw their children's style as balking at both Mexican and working-class traditions. This is a still from the revival that happened on Broadway recently. And this is Henry and Rudy's parents. And in the play, this family tension is seen when Henry and Rudy's mother asked them not to go out wearing zoot suits. The flashiness and excessiveness of the zoot suit actively resisted the notions that working-class Mexican Americans should be reserved and conservative. I'm pretty sure I have aunts who own that apron right there. And then he's obviously dressed up like as a mechanic. So the zoot suit, the flashiness of that is going against that grain. And so the conflict between both the dominant Anglo-American culture and the Mexican tradition of their parents showcases that Mexican-American youth who embraced zoot suits and the counterculture surrounding it were defining themselves apart from both cultures and began expressing themselves as uniquely Chicano, which does not simply mean a combination of Mexican-American culture, but rather through the tensions and contradictions of their Mexican heritage and American citizenship, they are creating something new. So while Valdez is able to relay the nuances and formation of Chicano identity through El Pachuco and Henry, what isn't as much highlighted in the play is how young Mexican-American women also embraced zoot suit culture as Pachucas and were also at the forefront of creating Chicano-ness. So these are kind of some examples of Pachucas. On the left, you can kind of see them getting arrested by the police officer here. And Marcy McMahon discusses the importance of the Pachuca identity by arguing, quote, by investing in style and sexualized dress, Pachucas went against working-class constructions of the dutiful daughter, as well as middle-class standards of proper femininity. So, while the two main female characters of Zoot Suit are not Pachucas, they both are rather defined through being love interests of Henry. One of them being his girlfriend Della Barrios, who exemplifies a reserved, dutiful daughter stereotype, while the other female character is Alice Broomfield, who's a Jewish reporter and activist who becomes a leading member of the Sleeping Lagoon Defense Committee and is also a love interest of Henry's while he is incarcerated. So while Valdez missed an important opportunity to represent Chicano women as essential to the Zoot Suit culture, this does serve as a reminder that not all Mexican-American youth were partaking in the subculture. Lucas explains that, quote, they were teenagers experimenting with clothes, language, music, dance, and through the media characterized all Mexican-Americans as pachucos. Only 3 to 5% of Mexican-Americans in the 1940s actually wore a Zoot Suit. What is important to contextualize out of this quote is not simply that Zoot Suiters were a small minority of Mexican-American youth population, but rather that the media had criminalized Zoot Suit wearers and positioned all young Mexican-Americans to be Zoot Suiters. So therefore, they criminalized the entire generation of Mexican-Americans. Criminalization of Mexican-American youth by the media and the court system is a main theme throughout the movie and the play. Some quotes that allude to the criminalization of the Pachucos as being innate to their Mexican ethnicity include, quote, you weren't even wearing clothes when we pulled you out of the jungle, and calling the boys on trial inborn, bloodthirsty Aztecs. This depiction isn't far off from reality, where media outlets such as the Hearst newspaper, the Los Angeles Examiner, and the conservative Los Angeles Times began to play up Mexican juvenile delinquents as, quote, criminals, baby gangsters, and murderers who were endangering the citizens of Los Angeles. LAPD's Captain Edward Ayers submitted a gripping report regarding the inherently violent nature of Mexicans, saying all the Mexican element knows or feels is a desire to kill or at least let blood. When there is added to this inborn characteristic that has come down through the ages, the use of liquor, then we certainly have crimes of violence. So under the shadow of World War II, maybe even a more damning condemnation came through portraying Pachucos as anti-patriotic and even further suggesting that Zoot Suiters were under the influence of Nazi and Japanese forces in order to undermine the American war effort. This framing of Pachucos as both criminal and anti-patriotic and as a characteristic of all young Mexican Americans is what allowed military forces and civilians to perpetrate sanctioned violence and terror upon the Chicano movement during the so-called Zoot Suit riots. A journalist recounted the riots as, quote, marching through the streets of downtown Los Angeles, a mob of several thousand soldiers, sailors, and civilians proceeded to beat up every Zoot Suiter they could find. Pushing its way through the Emporium Motion Picture theaters, the mob ordered the management to turn the house lights and then ran up and down the aisles, dragging Mexicans out of their seats. Streetcars were halted while Mexicans and some Filipinos and Negroes were jerked from their seats, pushed into the streets, and beaten with a sadistic frenzy. This endorsed racialized violence in one of the U.S.'s largest cities is happening while American forces are positioned as the beacons of freedom and equality, fighting the racist and genocidal fascism of the Axis powers. Some of those soldiers are members of the same racialized groups that are being targeted on American city blocks. The contradictions between what the U.S. says it stands for abroad and the bloody reality at home will influence soldiers of color's demands for actual equality when they return home from war, and will set the stage for a multitude of civil rights battles that will ensue over the following decades. The legacies of the Zoot Suit riots and the Sleepy Lagoon murder trial are crucial to understanding several threads of 20th century U.S. history, but these histories have been sorely undertaught for generations. While we are rightfully celebrating Chicano and Chicano culture and the Mexican-American community of Topeka, it becomes imperative to resist the idea that providing culturally diverse plays or teaching ethnic studies is just for students of color. The production of Zoot Suit is not a good deed thrown at Latino students so they feel more represented. This is not to say representation in media and history is not incredibly important, but teaching ethnic studies is not just teaching history to and for students of that ethnic background. The inclusion of ethnic studies in works of fiction means structuring history in a more complete manner that benefits all students. Thank you. Is there a Q&A? Do I have to answer questions? You wanna ask
If anybody
questions?
has questions, definitely.
What was the purpose of the chains?
What was the purpose of it?
the chain they wore?
I think it was just fly. I don't know, does any of the cast members, you know, the wardrobe, is wardrobe here?
It was aesthetic.
It was just aesthetic, yeah.
Okay.
Okay, we go here, then here to Mrs. Vega.
When did they stop wearing the Zoot Suits?
That's a good question. So, Zoot Suits kept, so probably throughout the 40s, and then the style kind of changed. Actually, at the panel that on last Thursday, some of the community members who were on the panel mentioned that the transition from Zoot Suits to like the next generation adopted more like traditional like conservatives, like like suits and to fit into this kind of like more assimilation model. So after the war and after, so I would say like once it enters the 50s and like the nuclear family and conservativeness, I would say. Mrs. Vega.
When I used to teach Zoot Suit, I ran across an article, and I just wondered if you were familiar with this, that said that the Zoot Suit riots might have lasted longer, except that we were trying to negotiate a treaty with Mexico at the time, and so Mexico heard about it and put some pressure on the president, and then, so that's why it was maybe a little shorter.
Yeah, and the reason they don't know is because also civilians were, so like civilian kind of violence kept happening, but they were able to like just keep the soldiers on base. So they were like the quote I read where they hop on taxi cabs and ride into LA. So they were able, they kind of just kept them on base as a way that they stopped the riots. But again, the time period is very, like some of the newspapers were reporting that it was only 3 days. Some of it longer, but 9 days was kind of like the nice median from where I chose, so you're correct.
We still do have people wearing them. Norbert Blue Adame. He does wear that stuff.
There we go. So there's still Zoot Suiters repping in Topeka.
I'm wearing it next Saturday.
I'll wear one to teach in.
How do you see the history of Zoot Suit obviously taking place in California, but with the degradation of Mexican and Mexican Americans, the disrespect, the blatant racism, the pulveting by law enforcement, looking at it back then and looking at it now in various contexts, do you as a young person feel that there's been a whole lot of change?
Oh, I was talking to my advisor earlier today to see if I could like talk about how culture is still criminalized, and I think that's really like represented in Trayvon Martin. Like he was killed because he was wearing a hoodie, and so I think that very much still happens today, and so yeah, and I think young people still know that, and it's very much part of growing up. My mom would always tell me not to sag my pants. I think that's still very much a thing that's happening now. That parents structured so you don't get assumed to be involved with anything based on the way you're dressed. He has a question. Oh, you have an announcement. Okay. Anyone else? Anyone? Last call? Oh, yes.
I don't think people know I wear my chain and stuff like that, and hat and everything like that. But I can tell when they ask me, what do you think? I said, it's part of my culture. And I wear this with pride, not because I want to look bad or anything like that. And I tell the kids the same thing too, because they borrowed my hat, my chain. I said, I wear it with pride. I don't want you to go up there and have that, but you going like that. It's style. That's part of our culture. And when I give my hat back, I want it back the way I gave it to you. Wear it with pride.
And that's what my grandpa said about getting the hand-me-downs from his cousins, is that they were like, you better, treat this with respect.
Luis Valdez, when he founded El Teatro Campesino, was trying to ignite the farm workers of that time to get involved in civil rights and become more active based on the little actos that he put on. Do you see Topeka High putting on Zoot Suit and that it might have any influence on the community about immigration or anything like that?
Oh yeah, I think that's kind of what I was trying to get at, is that works of fiction like this are able to almost teach history, but also like kind of like get at the emotion of things better than sometimes reading this. And so I think that's incredibly true. Especially I know a lot of Topeka High students walked out a month ago as well. So I think this is already like a politically engaged group, and Topeka High has been kind of a center for that. It was when I was in high school, and I know people talked about walking out in the 70s as well. So I think it's a long tradition at Topeka High. I think producing Zoot Suit is along with that tradition.
One more question. During your research here in Topeka and around Kansas and at the university level, people that are from Kansas, what has been your take about, that are Latino, Mexican American, specifically about referring to themselves, or you referring to them as Chicano?
Yeah, my mom is very much against that. I've like talked about that to her. And so, I think my grandpa also refers to himself as Mexican American, but he's kind of, of the older generation. But so I'm starting to do oral histories, but I haven't only done my grandpa. And so that's definitely going to be something I ask, because that wasn't a word that was thrown around when I was growing up, or is still not. But I think it's as much as a political choice as it is defining someone by their ethnicity.
I know my dad, he didn't like that word Chicano, man. Don't even mention the word around here. When I dressed up, sometimes the way I dressed, Mom told me, you look like a pachuco. I said, no, I'm not a pachuco, I'm just dressing the way I dress. So Mom, seen that, my dad said, yeah, Chicano, so there was a lot of, but they never really criticized me, they thought, but that's not what I thought, I just like to dress up,
I participated in a walkout at Topeka High in 1970, and the day we walked out, we shocked not just the greater community, we shocked our own community when we did that. And we had a meeting, what was the name of that place next to Nate Valdivia's house? It was
a Casa Fondiga.
Yeah, we had a meeting there with community members there, and there were people there who were just as angry at us as the principal was when you threatened not to let me graduate. And we called ourselves Chicanos, and we did it on purpose. It was a badge of honor. We felt like we were saying something when we adopted that name, and but it became a point of conflict within the community. There were people at that meeting and at subsequent meetings where we met with members of the community who said, we cannot support you if you're going to call yourself that, because it means chicanery, as far as I'm concerned. That's a bad word. So we didn't change our word, what we called ourselves, but we recognized that was a point of conflict for people within our own community.
And I think that's also like happening in LA as well, and like I kind of hinted that generational conflict, and that's very much, the parents of these Zoot Suiters were like, you should just be in line, like just follow the assimilation pattern, like don't, ruffle any feathers. And so I think that is not just, happening here in Topeka, but it's happening there, happening in New York, happening everywhere.
Just like when the brown berets, we squared by the brown berets, like Chicanos and stuff like that. So I was involved with a lot of that stuff like that. And we had meetings busted by the cops and stuff like that. But the only thing they take us in, a lot of our own people didn't like us being called brown beret or Chicano. But we were doing it because of a reason. We wanted to be known what was happening, it wasn't that we were, again, acting bad or anything like that. We wanted to be heard. That's what, and we were being heard. We even had some of the people in the GI forum criticizing our group, but that's not the reason we're doing that. We're doing it to be heard and let them know what's going on. See, back then, a lot of our parents were still afraid. They were afraid. But we were trying to come up with, hey, this got to stop.
Yeah.
So that's the way we did. We had the brown beret, we had meetings in Kansas City, we got busted and that like that. So that's the reason we did. We got the word brown berets and Chicano, no, it was time to be heard.
And I think that's like really just highlighting the importance of why we're here today, and like the history that we are like very much not taught in schools or even like in our communities. And I think that's like really highlighting like why we're here.
One more thing, I want to say what's cool about Topeka High is that you can't really make a statement with your clothing because every single person there is making a statement. That's true. So it's like, we need to,
I think
all of it.
also this is like really highlighting the importance of community. And I was thinking about that today, like not just with my family or growing up in Oakland with my Mexican American community, but like Topeka High community. I'm a few years out of high school now, and like I just thinking about like the foundation of what Topeka High meant to me. I think the older I get, the more I appreciate my high school days, and for all the high school students, they like enjoy it. I miss it.
And I think, Neill, we need to give a big round of applause
Yes.
to both Nancy
Steve Vega and Jeff
to
Kaufman.
Jeff Kaufman. Nancy has been pushing for at least a decade, if not more, to get Zoot Suit to Topeka. And she approached me last year with first initial ideas of how we could come on board to help. But without her pushing for it and knowing that there was a group of kids that wanted it and that everybody that needed it, we wouldn't be seeing this right now. And Jeff has just immersed himself and his kids in the culture, and we're very grateful for that, so.
Yeah. And again, they're selling tickets also, so get your advance ticket as well. Is that your announcement? Okay.
I was gonna make this for him.
Okay.
Thank you for that, that was really nice.
Anything else? Am I good? Am I done? Okay.
Thank
Oh,
you.
wait, hold on, my Nino, yes.
Well, one more.
I graduated at Highland Park the same time George did. And at that same time, we had the Black Power, Brown Power thing, that movement from the late sixties into the seventies. And yeah, it was a different thing. And when we grew up, our parents wanted us to speak English, perfect English. That way, we didn't have the tone of being Spanish. They don't want us to really speak Spanish. And the only time you heard us speak Spanish was on weekends when we were down at Grandma's. And that made
Or when they didn't want you to know.
they didn't want us to know what was going on. So they had their own little quarterback. So,
Your school's the reason we didn't make the front page of the paper.
that's right.
We walked out on the same day,
And we burned
somebody
the
set fire to the
What's the George's dad wanted him to speak perfect English, and so he wanted him to be very capable and speak proper English. And then when George had children, his dad would come over and say, "What if these kids know Spanish?" It was really irritated. So it just kind of changed.
Thank you, Neil.
Thank you.